So let's start this off with a callback. If you saw my very first Disney ranking video, then you'll remember I said I was currently reading Bambi's Children, the official sequel to the original Bambi, A Life in the Woods. For those that didn't, hey surprise! Bambi was based on a young adult novel that spanned a series of kids' books. Just from looking online, there seems to be at least 5 of these things, and for those of you paying attention, you heard me say these are kids' books, but the original is a young adult novel. Yeah, Disney weren't the first people to water down the source material, and it's also hard to tell who watered it down less or more. See, Salton's books, aside from the first Bambi, used to be hit with really hard censorship over here in the States. They left the first one alone, and I could not tell you why, letting it stay true to the text. But the following installments apparently used to cut out a lot of content, until very recently. I finally finished reading Bambi's Children this January, and from my research, it seems my copy is from after they stopped the censoring. If that's true, I think I figured out why there is censoring. That's because these books really are so much more kid-friendly than the original. I'm guessing they left the first alone because it was so clearly a young adult novel, they just didn't bother. Now don't get me wrong, there's still the threat of death. Man is still treated like some sort of being beyond comprehension. But neither are as hard or as dark as they were before. These characters also just don't talk the way they do in the original. I said before in that first video, A Life in the Woods is genuinely one of my favorite novels. It captures animals as characters like nothing else I've experienced before. They never sound like the traditional characters in a fictional story, the way animals are done. They sound like what you would assume a real animal would say and think. So for my money, the sequel drops the ball. It's more of a case of the franchise turning into something that's not up my alley. There is still some gold in a couple of pages, but the book took me a year to read because I just kept getting so bored of it that I put the bookmark in and I read something else for a while. The first is purely for young adults. Way too harsh and way too real for little kids. But the sequels go for standard children's literature. Nothing wrong with those, but certainly not as interesting to someone like me. Now, why does that sound?
From the imagination of Walt Disney, innocence was born. Friendships were formed, and a legacy was created. Now,
look who's here!
An all-new movie.
Boy, am I glad to see you.
Bambi was the only film out of the Disney Golden Era to get a direct-to-video sequel. Please stop typing Fantasia got a sequel. Listen to what I said. Direct-to-video, not sequel in general. I know there's a Fantasia 2000. The DTV sequels don't get as much hate online as they used to, but that's not to say people suddenly love them. It's more like the anger has left, and now people just see them as the weird thing that happened. As I've mentioned before, Disney was far from the only company that did it. Now, some of them are still hated. Equally though, some of them have a minor or major fan base. I want to say Bambi 2 is actually in the latter. It's not one of the most beloved ones like, say, the Lion King sequels or the Aladdin sequels that I just covered very recently. But even still, people really like the effort put into Bambi and the Great Prince's relationship for this interquel, as you may call it. Having Patrick Stewart voice the latter helped things a lot.
How do you know you don't like it if you've never tried it? Bambi! A prince does not woo-hoo.
He doesn't?
Prince maintains control at all times. Display dignity. Walk with pride.
Now to cover the plot real quick, and to also answer a question you probably did not have until the beginning of my video. The events of this movie are an in-between quill or interquill. For those who've never heard that term before, that is a secondary installment that is set in the middle of the previous one. In this movie's case, it's filling in the gaps of just after Bambi's mother died, up until that spring where Bambi gets older. Maybe something you didn't really wonder what was happening there, but now we have this direct-to-video film to kind of fill you in if you felt like having it. So yeah, the 2 is a little bit, well, it's not wrong, because it is the second Bambi film from Disney, but it doesn't take place after it. So then that answers the hypothetical question you'd be having if your knowledge of Bambi 2 only came from the beginning of my video here. It has nothing to do with the Bambi book sequel. As I said at the top, that book is called Bambi's Children. It does take place after the original Bambi. It's the adventures of Gino and Guri, Bambi's kids. Speaking of Bambi's kids, just want to bring this up real quick as a not-so-fun fact. Didn't have time to put this in the original video when I was doing the Golden Age stuff. I'm going to confirm an old internet rumor. In the early 2010s, people were wondering something about Bambi, the Disney film, and sometimes this is the kind of thing people are looking too into it. Not so much here. People were wondering, by the way Bambi's mother was talking to Feline's mother in that one scene where they're first introduced, and they seemed to be a little bit too close, as in family members. So people wondered online, hey, did Disney not have the guts to say Bambi and Feline were related? I've read the book. Bambi and Feline are canonically cousins in the book. Gino and Guri are inbred. Okay, back to the video. So the second book and the second movie don't have anything to do with each other on paper in the slightest. In practice, they're shockingly similar as products, however. Generic and acceptable kids' media that have a few moments that step above the competition. In Bambi's Children specifically, there's this decently long section where Guri is trapped by a park ranger whom finds her injured and heals her. This is the bit where the atmosphere and the dialogue feels the closest to the original that I fell so in love with. And the park ranger also subverts the attitudes of all the other human characters. He's not remotely malicious, and unlike that one family from the first book, he's not incompetently nice either. It's such a nice and refreshing take that, even if you're not familiar with the first book, is such a big status quo change-up that it's really refreshing. As for Bambi 2, I hinted at this already, but it's the father-son dynamic and how very well written it actually is. There's also some really good character growth for Bambi. And also, while not everything in the movie is well executed, the climax really is. It's shockingly gripping and very exciting. But remember I said generic kid stuff. So for me, they got a little bit too boring. Equally too boring. I don't have much else to say about the book, because I feel I've already done enough by saying it's a book I took breaks from reading. For the movie, I can at least talk about some other things, especially since I have yet to say how it holds up to its original. Although, yeah, it's got nothing on Disney's Bambi, which, if you don't remember the video, or maybe you just hadn't seen it, my opinion on Disney's Bambi was that it did not personally reach the heights of the book, but it does an excellent job at adapting the source material into a family feature film. It's still dark, it's still grand, and while Bambi does feel more like a human child in a deer's body than he does an actual deer, I don't really mind that because it really helps the coming-of-age aspect of the film. The direct-to-video sequel sometimes does know how to get in the feet of the greatness of the first film. There are shots and moments that feel like callbacks for the sake of callbacks, but I think the attempt was actually just to make it feel more accurate. It makes it stick out like a sore thumb sometimes, but I also appreciate the effort. Partially it's the animation though. While the animation does look very good for a direct-to-video, it doesn't look enough like the original film. This was actually my second time watching Bambi 2, and I can't say I liked it as much as that first time. I think I just appreciated what it did so much that first time, I tricked myself into thinking it was an average film with some really great highlights. On this rewatch, it was a bit too juvenile, a bit too kiddie. I felt it was more mediocre with some really good highlights. And that's the funny thing, and I guess the thesis of what you could call for this comparison. Bambi's Children and Bambi 2 are sequels to something called Bambi, and they have very similar attitudes and feelings to each other, despite the fact, technically, they are not related in the slightest. Unlike Bambi and Faline. Personally, I think both earn a 2.5 out of 5. Thanks for making it this far in the video, if you did. Or thanks for watching. Remember to like if you liked the video. Subscribe for more content like this. Shoot me a comment if you have opinions on Bambi, especially the book and the book's sequels. Those aren't talked enough online. And I forgot to mention this until the very end. The first book finally entered the public domain. So if you can, go check out like a public domain website or something like that, because you can legally do that for the book now, because more people should be familiar with the book. You might like the movie more. I could end up in the minority here, but the book is still well worth reading all these years later. If you are able to, consider supporting me on Patreon, because, well, once I get enough patrons, and by that I mean one more, I can start doing votes for which Disney film or educational game that I might tackle next, because that's kind of how these direct-to-video stuff is probably going to go in the near future when they're solo entries like this one. If you don't hurry, you'll never know when I get around to The Fox and the Hound 2.